Alright, we're back, we're talking some Final Fantasy VII Remake / Rebirth. We have an interview with Teruki Endo, battle director, of course, for the remake games. They did at GDC with Inverse. It's not a super long interview, and of course, because it's with Endo, it's entirely about the combat, but there's some interesting bits throughout that are worth talking about. But I think the most interesting thing from this, Endo talks about all kinds of different aspects of, like, the combat system, right? But he does talk about, like, the final boss fighting sequence and stuff at the end of Rebirth, which is, somewhat controversial. I think the most interesting thing in the interview is a post-interview follow-up with Hamaguchi, where he confirms that when it comes to Remake or Rebirth, there was never any plans for additional characters. Like, the characters that are playable in each game were always kind of set in stone. So there was never a time when, like, Red 13 was actually playable in Remake, and there was never a time that, like, Cid or Vincent would have been playable in Rebirth. So let's just hop right into it. Remaking a game like Final Fantasy VII is a nearly impossible task. How do you redefine one of the most important games ever made and make sure it brings in new fans without alienating the old? When the Remake trilogy was announced, it was an unprecedented project, something we'd never seen in video games. Now, in retrospect, we know the successes and failures of what Square Enix has done with 2 games. One factor that there's almost no debate on, though, is Remake and Rebirth's universally beloved battle system. It's a masterful modernization of the series' iconic combat and a passion project for battle director Teruki Endo, who always wanted to work on a Final Fantasy game. During the Game Developers Conference GDC 2025, Endo gave a presentation on crafting the innovative combat system, and Inverse had an exclusive interview to learn even more. I definitely have to agree with that, right? I think the combat system of Remake and Rebirth is the one thing that I don't see very much complaints about. The only people that really complain about it are, like, old heads that just like turn-based RPGs, so they just don't like action RPGs in general, or people that just don't like action RPGs, even if they're not like a turn-based RPG fan, right? People who aren't necessarily fans of like the direction they're going with the remake games in terms of like the story presentation and the possibilities of what could be going on are still usually fans of the combat system. And I do think it's like the best combat system I've ever experienced in an action RPG. It's just one of those parts of the remake games that you don't see very many people complain about, if at all. And generally, if they are complaining, they're either just not fans of action RPGs, or maybe they're just not good at the combat of the game. The only sort of kind of complaint that I have, and it's a very minor one, it literally doesn't fucking matter, is like items being tied to ATB. It's just something I'm just not a fan of. I realize the game would be significantly easier if we could just use items on the fly all the time, but really, like, that only is there to like hinder people that aren't very good at the combat. It's admittedly a very weird complaint because I don't really use items that much anyways, at least in combat. Maybe outside of combat I might heal my characters really quickly with some potions or some shit. But like when it came to Remake, I definitely would have used a bunch of items through my playthrough just because I was kind of like newer to the combat, and I would say I'm not very good at action RPGs. I think I've gotten better as time's gone on because I've committed to playing more of them. And through my Rebirth, like first playthrough, I don't think I used items at all. There might have been a time or two where I had to like maybe revive some characters with like Phoenix Downs before I got revived materia, but I wasn't like, hitting potions and shit during combat, and especially obviously not in hard mode where you can't use items anyways. So there's just like this weird limitation on items when it comes to the remake games where it's like it costs an ATB in battle to use something, but you can use it freely all you want to outside of battle. But then also when you get to hard mode, you can't use items at all. So it's like there's just like this. It's a strange limitation on items. I don't know exactly if I'm making sense at all. Again, it's probably for the better that we have to use an ATB in battle to use an item, because otherwise it'd probably break the game, right? But I found myself not using really any items at all when it comes to the remake games. Like, if at the same time, given the limitation of items in hard mode, does it really matter how like easy mode or normal mode would be? Like, who gives a shit? Those aren't really that complicated. If you're like somewhat competent action RPGs, it's not really that hard. I'm spending a lot more time on this topic than I thought I would, but like I mentioned previously, like it hinders people that aren't that good at the game. It'd be nice if there was like a setting or maybe like an accessory that you could give to people that aren't super good at the game that would allow them to maybe use items like kind of freely throughout combat, at least in normal mode. Maybe you used to limit them in hard mode and shit, obviously, but that way they could like get through the game if they're struggling with the combat easier. I didn't really look at different Final Fantasy titles, as I felt like if I leaned too much on them, it would prevent me from pushing the envelope. I tried to look at it from a very sort of flat, non-biased way. I want to take the feeling of fun of a command-based battle, that feeling you get, not necessarily the system itself. So I built the system from scratch, and it might have been a coincidence that parts of it felt similar to other games, like Final Fantasy XIII. So I thought that part was kind of weird, because with the end where they compare it to Final Fantasy XIII, I don't know if that's Endo saying that, or if Inverse is kind of like add that in or something. But either way, it doesn't make any sense, because I don't see any fucking similarities between the remake, Rebirth combat, and Final Fantasy XIII. Admittedly, I've only played the first Final Fantasy XIII game, but the only similarities are the use of ATB, because that's like still like almost traditional sort of turn-based combat, right? You fill up your ATB and then you put in input, attack commands or whatever. It's nothing like action RPG at all, so I don't even understand the comparison. And obviously with like the paradigm shift stuff, like it's its own thing. It's kind of similar to obviously like the dress sphere stuff when it comes to Final Fantasy X too, but still it's like its own thing, completely different from Remake. Endo was hired by Square Enix early in the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. It was already decided that the game would use an action-based combat system, but past that, there was no real definition for what the system would look like. Before joining Square, Endo worked on planning for the Monster Hunter series, including as lead game designer on Monster Hunter World. During that time, he says he accumulated knowledge working on the various action elements of Monster Hunter that worked to his advantage, and when combined with Square's technology and unique skills, it created a chemical reaction. But that core question of how to create something innovative that still held true to the original game was at the heart of everything, both in terms of the challenges and opportunities. Of course, one of the unique aspects was that this remake trilogy was being split into 3 different games, and that meant the combat system would need to be dynamic enough to grow across each game. So yeah, the innovation of combat is something that's definitely interesting when it comes to the remake games, right? Something we've seen them evolve from Remake to FF7 Mission to Rebirth, and of course very much looking forward to how they evolve the combat going into the 3rd game, and it's something that I wish they kind of sort of tease with this or whatever. Like, I don't expect them to give us anything substantial with this interview, but like, just there's not even like a hint or even like a remote discussion or a vague thing about anything in regards to part 3 of this interview, which is kind of frustrating. But ironically, that wasn't at the top of Endo's mind, as his style instead focuses on the immediate. That even applied to the game's materia system, as Endo wasn't concerned with keeping more powerful materia for later games, but rather what would result in the best experience for Final Fantasy VII Remake at the time, and then again with Rebirth. I don't really give too much thought in terms of long-term planning, but put my all into whatever I'm working on. If I think too much about what's supposed to come ahead, I get too tied up in that thinking, feeling like whatever I put in that moment will be incomplete. I want to put my full focus into whatever project I'm on, then add to it and build from there. I think that will eventually lead to a better conclusion, and a similar approach was used for the materia system. I thought it's kind of funny that they mentioned like not focusing on like some of the stronger materia and saving that for later games, when like some of the strongest materia in the original FF7 we don't have yet. You know, stuff like Mime and Final Attack and Double Cut and Slash All and obviously Knights of the Round. Like, these are things that are regarded some of the strongest materia in the original FF7 that, again, we don't currently have. And obviously they would have gone out of their way to not include them in the earlier games. There's also a quote from one of the devs a while ago, and I don't remember which dev it was, and I don't remember if it was like the marketing shit for Remake or FF7 Remission or Rebirth or whatever, but specifically one of the devs, maybe Nomura, mentioned like flare magic and not wanting to include that in like the first game or something because it wouldn't make sense, right? That's something that you would include in the later games because it's some of the strongest magic. So even if Endo himself isn't necessarily focused on like the higher end magics or materials or whatever, somebody is. I was actually able to track down the quote, and it was Hamaguchi with a VG247 interview, and it was May 2020, so we're talking after Remake, obviously not even leading up to fucking episode or mission yet, but he mentions the flare magic. So there's actually 2 different answers where he mentions the flare magic. He says, for materia, we did refrain from using the ultimate magic such as flare, but apart from that, we incorporated new ideas with an open mind without sticking too closely to the rules of the original. And then he also says, we did refrain from using the ultimate magic materia such as flare and the more advanced skills for the benefit of future games, but our first priority was to make a game design that enables us to be a standalone experience for people to enjoy on its own. Your boy is unfortunately an encyclopedia when it comes to FF7 Remake knowledge. I don't always remember everything, but I remember most things that I've talked about on the channel. Yeah, clearly there is some level of trying to keep some of the strongest magic for the 3rd game, because it wouldn't make sense. It'd be the equivalent of, like, if Cloud got his, like, ultimate sword in the 1st game. Like, this wouldn't make sense. Why would we have that? You want to save the stronger magic for the last game, obviously. In a post-interview follow-up, director Naoki Hamaguchi says, all of the playable characters implemented for both Remake and Rebirth were structured according to the initial directions we set for titles. Hamaguchi confirms Red 13 and K-S's placement as playable characters matches those initial plans, and apparently there weren't ever any plans for additional playable characters in either Remake or Rebirth. Essentially, when it comes to Remake, it was always going to be the 4, right? Cloud, Tifa, Bear, Aerith. And there's never a time where Red 13 was going to be a playable character. Maybe he was always going to be a character relegated to the sequel, and kind of in the same vein with Rebirth, there's never a time where like Sid or Vincent were going to be playable characters, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about. Like, they've had this kind of like through line with what characters are going to be in each game as a playable character this entire time. His inverse does point out the next paragraph that's like a testament to how solid of a foundation the Remake games are built on, the fact that they've had that idea this entire time and stuck with it. That's not to say elements of Rebirth didn't change heavily during development, and one of those, in particular, was the final sequence of boss battles at the end of the game. We wanted players to have that sense of a finale, but at the same time, we have to provide a sort of hurdle to overcome. It was a balance, because we don't want to interrupt the battle and prevent the players from pouring themselves in emotionally. There was some thinking behind making the difficulty a bit less than a typical boss battle, but as we were building it and receiving feedback, there were comments that we wanted more, so it ended up becoming difficult. So obviously, if you guys have played Rebirth to completion, you've experienced the gauntlet of the boss fights at the end. That even on like normal difficulty, it's kind of hard just because of how many fights you have to do. And there's like a randomness to it, right? In terms of like, it's something with like the order that you see characters appear on the right screen when you go into the Genova fight right before Sephiroth Reborn. And like that dictates who's in your party where at all the different iterations of the fight and stuff like that. And obviously on hard mode, that makes things very, very complicated because you have to be kitted pretty well for hard mode to make fights a lot easier. I guess at one point in development, like those string of fights were easier, and for whatever reason, people wanted it to be more difficult. And I don't know if they just made the fights harder or just added more fights or something. If I'm not mistaken, I think there was a quote from maybe the Ultimate or some shit where like at one time there's even more fights with like the ending sequence, which would have just been ridiculous. I actually have a bit of a funny story for the hard mode playthrough. I was following Optinoob's guides for a lot of the harder fights in the game, and with the ending sequence especially, because that's just like complicated as hell. And like you can respec Cloud right before you go into the Sephiroth fight with like Zack and Cloud, And I ended up like resetting in some way where reset all my characters. I kept like dying to Sephiroth, and I was getting frustrated having to like resplit Cloud every single time. And ended up resetting in some way where like when I got to the end of the sequence of fights where it's just Cloud and Aerith against Sephiroth, Aerith had nothing. So like I was doing that final fight against Sephiroth. I think I did like fucking 15 times or something, maybe 20 times. And Aerith had pretty much nothing on her. She had like one materia randomly on her. I don't remember what it was. But I was pretty much soloing that fight with Cloud, and obviously like, Aerith's Arcane Ward where you can like do double magic or whatever. But it's pretty much just solo Cloud against Sephiroth at the end. It was very complicated. Endo adds that he thinks it's important to have extra challenges outside of the story for players who want a bit more. That's why ultra hard editions like Vice from Episode Intermission were made for players who want to enjoy the game for as long as possible. And like the harder fights in Rebirth are something I have a love-hate relationship with because like they weren't super hard when I'm following a guide, of course. But like the Zack and Cloud one were especially complicated, and really it wasn't super hard once I figured out the mechanics of like the first several fights in that. But it was Odin at the end, and like my biggest issue was like getting to the last fight with Odin and Zack being alive, because he kept like going into that fight either really damaged or just straight up dead sometimes. I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to beat this with just Cloud, so I just lose. Or Zack got knocked out early in the Odin fight, and it's like I'm gonna lose anyways. Throughout those course of fights in that simulator with Zack and Cloud, like the fucking AI was so aggro on Zack for me, like all the time, dude. It was like rough to get him to the end game. But my dude, that is pretty much the video. There's of course more to this interview that we didn't talk about. We always try to leave a little bit of extra in case you guys want to go check it out for yourself. Where Endo does talk about like, you know, kind of character roles and stuff and whatever. He doesn't tease anything interesting, you know, for Sid or Vincent, which would be nice, but we don't get anything from that really. I'm very much interested in what the class roles are going to be for those characters, because you obviously with the Cloud you have like a mixed attacker, and you can do magic or physical. You have a kind of a magic attacker healer with Aerith. You have a tank and like cover character with Baird, and obviously a stagger character with Tifa. It's like, what are the classes going to be essentially for Sid and Vincent, right? I mean, clearly Sid's like a dragoon and Vincent's a gunner or whatever you want to call it. But like, what does that dictate in a fight? Like, what is their role within a fight? What do they actually do? Like, that's different from the other characters. Anyways, though, that is the video. Subscribe to if you guys are new. Search networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @davidbusiness. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain, or leave it like Cobain.